So in this week's video, I have come back to one of my favorite forests in all of Denmark. And it's called Rold and it is the troll forest. And each time I come back to it, there's always something new to explore. And yeah, this morning, finally, I have fog in a winter is setting. Obviously, it's not winter. It is very mild today. It's raining and we have fog. So I get the naked trees. So it's all about the shapes of all these beautiful, gnarly beech trees that I'm photographing today. And I found myself a scene right here behind me. So you can see it here. You can just see how all these gnarly beech trees are coming up. I'm using here a little bit of a foreground, and you can see we have this branch sticking into the scene. So I have put my camera on 10-second timer, then I run into the scene and then I take the photograph. I'm also at around 100 millimeters on my Tamron 28-200. You can't see that, totally out of focus. But I'm using the Tamron 28-200. And the theme of today's video is all the mistakes that you want to avoid that you can do with your standard lenses. That would be 24-70, 24-105, and arguably a 28-200 millimeter, even though it's falling into the super zoom range. Nikon has also just released a 24-120. I'll also include that in the bunch. But the first mistake is, in my humble opinion, to actually use a 24-70 millimeter lens. There are a lot of benefits to a 24-70 millimeter lens. Many of them go all the way down to f2.8, so they can take in a little bit more light. However, the 24-105, 24-120, they have that wider focal range. And even though they are only f4, I find that for landscape photography, they are way better. And the downside usually to a longer focal range is that the image quality is a little bit worse. But with the newer lenses, you can almost not, sorry, you can almost not see the difference. So the next mistake to do is to not use proper quality glass. It's a little bit of an extension of the last tip or the first tip, but a lot of cameras come with a standard zoom lens when you buy them. Like if you're buying an APS-C, you get that 18-55 millimeter lens. And if you are buying like a Canon full frame, maybe a Sony full frame, you either get the 24-105 or 24-70. And for the most part, when it comes to the full frame lenses, the standard zoom lenses they come with are actually pretty decent these days. However, the APS-C cameras, you have to check up on the quality of the glass in the lenses. You can do that on DxO, the homepage there, and you can check how it is. Obviously, also just go to YouTube and check out some reviews on some lenses. And that is why lens reviews on YouTube does really well. So be careful of quality of the quality of the glass. The next tip is a little bit more important. It is to understand that your standard zoom lens, 24-70, 24-105, 24-120-ish, they deliver what most perceive as the most natural looking focal range, which is usually said to be 45-50 millimeter on a full frame lens. And it is thereabouts that you get a photo which is more or less in alignment with what you see with your own eyes. There's a lot of theory behind that. But the point is that in the wide end, you avoid that super wide angle look where everything is just super distorted. Everything in the background is far away and everything in the foreground is very close. And you avoid the long lens super compressed photos, which can also look a little bit flat or a little bit off. It's hard to explain why. What I found is that over the past years when I've been photographing in Denmark, actually also in the Faroe Islands, my most favorite photos have been in the focal range length between about 35 millimeter and then all the way up to maybe 150 or so millimeter. It is in that range. And that is the main reason why I'm using 24 to 105 and 28 to 200 millimeter the most. I just know that those are the photos I take that has the most longevity for me. It is the photos I personally enjoy for the longest time. And after all, isn't that what your landscape photography is about for yourself? So it's also a good idea to learn the image quality of your standard zoom lens. Maybe it's a little bit weaker in the wide end, which is the case with my Tamron 28 to 200. So usually do not use it from 28 to 35 millimeter. I use my 16 to 35 millimeter there instead. And some standard zoom lenses are a little bit weaker in the long end. So if you're using a 24 to 105, which is a little bit weak in the long end, it may be a good idea to use your telephoto zoom lens in that range instead. Like if you have a 70 to 200 millimeter or 100 to 400 millimeter, use that in the telephotos wide end or in the standard zooms long end instead. So you optimize your image quality. When I'm making this video talking about the mistakes you want to avoid with a standard zoom lens, I'm not saying that you should only bring a standard zoom lens out into the field. I always bring as wide as focal range as I can. So 3 lenses for the most part. So right now I'm working on this scene right here. I've been really trying different heights of my tripod, and I think this one here is the most optimal. So as you can see here, I'm trying to frame this background here among all this fallen over debris. This is a very living, breathing forest. We have had some winter storms, and I can see some stuff over here that has fallen over more. Actually, the branch that is laying right here must have fallen over this winter too. And then they have cut it over because I can see on the root system, which is in between here, that it has fallen over naturally, which is a little bit sad because it was a nice branch that kind of like went over, almost over the trail. I photographed it last year or 2 years ago. But yeah, so here's another photo. So another mistake that I see people do when it comes to landscape photography is to not benefit from both the vertical and the horizontal format. Turn your camera. It often helps to have an L bracket, which I have on my camera. It is this metal thing right here. So it's very, very easy to just take the camera off the tripod and then put this one in here in the Arca Swiss compatible. Make sure to get an L bracket that actually fits your camera, so it's not like hanging out here and the camera kind of like falls over or something like that. It's a mess. But yeah, use both horizontal and vertical format. Right now I'm working on a composition right here in front of me, and I really like these branches, this V shape here of these branches, and how this fallen over tree in here kind of like is the same shape as this one. And then I have these two trees that are like framing the background tree here also. And I'm working with both a horizontal and a vertical format. And I'm not really sure if this is going to be a horizontal 2x3 or 3x4 or 4x3 or 3x2 format. But yeah, that's the good thing with the standard zoom lens. It's very easy to move a little bit back, zoom in, and all of those things to find the optimal composition. And obviously, if you want to learn much more about composition, be sure to get my 2 ebooks here. I especially talk about vertical, horizontal formats, where it's beneficial to use either one, what you can get from either one in regard to the perception from the viewer when they're looking at your photos. I'm also talking about framing, I'm talking about shapes, geometry, all the good stuff that you need to compose your photos. So be sure to get down in the description of this video and pick up my 2 ebooks. Try out the first one first if you are in doubt, but they have lots of 5-star reviews, so I know a lot of people really enjoy them. So the next thing, which is just so utterly important to use to your benefit when you're using a standard zoom lens, is its ability to zoom and use the phenomenon of perspective compression. So this has in and of itself nothing to do with the lens. This is just something to do with how you place yourself in the scene relative to all the objects in the scene. And then due to the lens being able to have different focal lengths, you can do the same. If you haven't had an arsenal of like, I don't know, 10 primes, it would kind of be the same. But because you have a zoom lens, then you can photograph at 28mm, you can photograph at 50mm, you can photograph at 70mm, and so forth. And right now I am photographing this scene here, and especially in a forest scene, as I've talked about before on this channel, I generally try to avoid having too much of the sky in the scene. I always want to have some kind of background elements, so it looks as if the forest just continues forever into the fog. And also the sky has a tendency to create a lot of specular highlights, and in a predominantly dark scene we have a tendency to be attracted to the brighter parts of the photo, all those small white dots in the photo. So with a zoom lens, standard zoom lens, you can see here I'm filming at around 28mm, and here I'm filming at 50mm, and here I'm filming at around 70mm. And you can see how I'm actually photographing the same scene, but I'm moving further backwards and zooming a little bit in. And that creates this sense where the foreground of the scene comes a little bit closer to the background of the scene. And that is what I call perspective compression. Some people call it lens compression, but I hate that term because people think it has something to do with the lens. It is only the camera's position in relation to the scene in front of you. And then you can always zoom in. But it's not the lens in and of itself that creates this compression. The lens, when you zoom in, only crops the scene. I'm just going to film this scene, and you can see here where I'm only zooming into the scene. I'm not compressing the scene, I'm just zooming in, which is the same as cropping the scene. If you're in doubt about what I'm talking about, be sure to check out my 70 to 200mm video. Here I explain it in a little bit more detail. But here's the photo. So another big mistake that you can make is to not have everything in focus when you photograph it. When you're using the longer focal lengths on your standard zoom, 70mm, 105mm, you very fast get a very narrow depth of field, especially if you have a lot of depth in your scene. So right now, you can see I have the trail right here, camera, trail, and then my scene with these trees here. And even though there is like 4 or 5 meters to the foreground here, there is another 20 or so meters to the background right here. And that means that when I have framed up my scene like this, I will need to focus stack it. I cannot focus on something 1/3 into the scene and then get everything in focus. So I just focus on these trees right here, and then I focus on the background, and then I get 2 shots that I blend together either in Photoshop or some third-party app. This is something I cover in my huge post-processing course, Photoshop for Landscape Photographers, from beginner to advanced. So if you want to know how I edit all my photos, be sure to enroll in that course. Right now, I have a spring sale going on. I'm ending it very, very soon. So this may be one of your last chances to get entire $100 off. So there is a link down in the description, and you can read all about everything that you're going to learn. It's like 19 hours of all my Photoshop techniques. And hopefully it is designed in a progressive way so that you hopefully can get into Photoshop very fast and get to know all the tips and tricks I use in Photoshop. So also a link down below. So another mistake you want to avoid is to get blurry photos. When you're shooting with a telephoto zoom, you usually have what's called a lens collar. So you have a collar here, and then you actually put your camera on the tripod down here. On a wide-angle lenses have a tendency to not be very long, so they are fairly close also to the center of gravity for the camera. However, on standard zoom lenses, in this case here where I'm using my Tamron, but also on my Sony 24-105, we do not have lens collars. And when we zoom in, the lenses are usually designed so that they extend the tube, which means that you are offsetting the center of gravity a little bit. So there's a bigger risk of blur. So some of the things that you can do to avoid blurry photos is of course to have a very fast shutter speed. The faster the shutter speed, the less the scene moves relative over the screen. And you can of course avoid wind. That is usually a very great benefit for photographing in a forest. There's usually not a whole lot of wind. You can use 2-second timer so that when you hit the shutter button, it takes 2 seconds before the camera takes the photo. That removes all the small micro vibrations that you can get from pushing the button. You can obviously also use some kind of remote shutter, either with a line or as a little remote. And last thing is of course to have a proper tripod. For the most part, as long as it's a carbon fiber tripod, it doesn't have to be one of these super heavy ones as I have here from Benro. This is a Mark III from Benro. You can get away with like smaller travel carbon fiber tripods like the Benro Travel Angel series. They are also really good. So yeah, there's a few things that you can do to avoid blur, and be sure to implement them in your photography workflow. So right now I'm working on this scene right here. So I'm ignoring these 2 trees here in the foreground. I'm just photographing the trees here in the background. I think that this composition actually looks pretty cool. It makes for like. It's a very aesthetic photo. I'm getting both a horizontal and a vertical, and then we will see how that will turn out. And then I will probably use a whole lot of dehaze to really bring out the details of that photo while still making sure that the background fog is still there, so we get a lot of depth in the scene. Looking forward to see how this one will turn out. I think it looks good here. I'm just getting so spoiled today, and I gotta admit, it's about time. Oh, it has been so hard here in 2022. I think off to a rough start, but today I've got some photos that I'm really happy about. But yeah, another thing you may want to consider, a mistake to make, is to zoom in too much to your scene, so that you're cropping out too much. Since you do have a zoom lens, I would suggest, if you're in doubt about the crop of your photo, the scene, then make sure to zoom a little bit further out than you think you need. You can always crop it a little bit. You will of course lose a little bit of megapixels, but always crop it a little bit. In that way you make sure that you get everything well within the frame, because if it's harder to create what you have cropped out afterwards with fill content in Photoshop. I'm showing you how I do that in my Photoshop course, but it's obviously nice not to have to do that. So zoom a little bit further out than you think you need, then you can always crop it a little bit. Right now I'm working on this scene here right in front of me, and you can see I have it framed up like this. So I can zoom a little bit out and it still looks pretty good. I start to introduce this down here and a little bit of the sky, and I know that I don't want to have the sky in there, so I will zoom a little bit in, and I'll probably crop it a little bit more in post-processing. But this right here looks pretty good. So now I'm just going to get the exposure up and get the shot, and yeah, here it is. Once I had finished my photography in the gnarly forest, I went to a nearby hilly area as I had a vision for a telephoto lens shot. I made a small Instagram story from this shoot, so be sure to also follow me there, and here is the final result, which I think turned out so cool. The photo is taken at 400mm, so it is one of those very dramatic examples of perspective compression. It literally took me 15 minutes to get all the way over to the position. As I had the built-in intervalometer running with a 6-second interval, I ended up with 376 photos, which included about 100 more once I had returned. I then used 2 of my favorite photos, one of myself, and blended it with the most optimal background. I know this has nothing to do with standard lens mistakes, but I thought it would be interesting for those of you who saw my Instagram story to see the final result. Be sure to benefit from my spring sale and get your $100 off enrolling in my Photoshop course, and if you want to learn more about composition, get my 2 ebooks. There is all the information you need and links to everything in the description of the video. If you enjoyed this video, got some inspiration, or learned something, I'd highly appreciate both a like and a comment, and be sure to share the video with your photography friends. Thanks as always for watching along.